Evening, guys. Thanks for joining me again tonight. This is episode 6. It's our fourth one for the week, so it's actually quite interesting. There's so much to talk about. We've had some really good comments and feedback from you guys, and I really appreciate all of that. We've had some good questions coming in. Got a good question stream going for tonight. But yeah, we're going to get right into it. Topic tonight, obviously, what we spoke about, or we've mentioned aspects of this in quite a few of our chats, just mixing in general. I was sitting here thinking about it, and I think, engineers talking about how to mix is about swimmers talking about how wet the water is. There is no real way to explain it. You have to experience it. But there certainly is elements about the trade that is technical, and there's elements about the trade that's creative. And understanding your role in that obviously is very important. And I think if you're listening to this, you've obviously looked at quite a few mixing things. I often listen to guys when they talk about their approach to things. I tend to not sit and listen to when guys sort of want to tell you about this is the right way of doing about things, and other people are doing things wrong, because you've lost perspective already. Being a creative is like no one tells an artist what color to use. It's how they express themselves. But I think if anybody's ever listened to a guy talking about how to mix and what goes into mixing and things like that, then you end up in a scenario like this where before we start talking about anything technical, there's always phrasing that happens where you want to approach a perspective, you want to give context, you want to give outlines, you want to give insights into your approach, your motivation, all of these kind of things. And it's all important, and there's an excitement factor. I think like in any career, if you're not excited about what you're doing, then it's a job. And we've all said this to death. If it's I've never gone to work, I just do what I love. And that's something that's true for many people in many professions. But for tonight, I'm going to talk specifically about the sound engineer from a technician's point of view, front of house guy, live context. So we'll talk about broadcast stuff at another stage, because obviously that's a whole different kettle of fish, and that'll link in nicely with some of those broadcast topics that's come across in the last couple of days, with loudness and delivery standards and all those kind of things. But if you take it in a live context, I think the first thing that I have a strong opinion on, it's not always the case. There's very few times where this person plays a dual role. But most of the time when you're at front of house or even at monitors, your duty as a sound engineer obviously is to, for the lack of a different word, mix the sound. But in the context that you're in, you are not the producer. In other words, you're not creating anything. You're not creating a mix. I think that's a strong statement. If you give me a chance to explain it, if you're at front of house, your opportunity to represent the band or the entertainment that's happening on stage accurately to the people while they are creating the music is a talent. And that's not you creating the music. That's you doing due diligence to what's coming towards you in the signal parts. And it's obviously it starts way before, from capturing and being technically inclined and playing your part. But you have a responsibility towards the band and the musicians on stage to represent them to the audience that's come to see them. They've not come to listen to you. And I think that's something that a lot of guys struggle with. They want to be important, be in the limelight. I said this the other night. If I can walk to my car after a gig, I got goosebumps, and no one sees me, no one talks to me, that pretty much means I didn't do anything wrong. The band is being swamped by people. There's a recognition all around for them, and then I've done my job right. When I make a mistake, everybody looks to the sound guy. I think if you've been in a situation, where there's a flickering light in the corner somewhere, they'll come to the sound guy and ask him, can you fix that? Or, how much are the CD sales? Or, how much is the parking? Or anything like that. Because what you fail to realize sometimes is when you're in an auditorium, that position in front of a house is a point of authority for people that have just come to the show, where you're obviously not the normal person, so you must know things. And I think we've all seen the rounds of those T-shirts. It's, no, I don't have duct tape. No, I don't sell CDs. No, I can't get you a signature with a band. All those, from our perspective, was, no, I'm not the lighting guy. But it's just a responsibility we have. And I think if you can understand that position you have, and the approach you have, your attitude towards serving the production is so much stronger. And you need to enjoy yourself. And we've all also heard the saying, garbage in, garbage out. If the band is really not there and it's a mix mash, you're a panel beater out front, you can try as much as you want. You'll get nice tones here and there, but it's never that cohesive mix, because that's what you're getting. And I think if you understand that perspective, then it's a good start. Taking for granted the fact that you've got a technical inclination, you understand the gear that's in front of you, you know how it all works, you've got responsibility, then if you've all that stuff nailed down, you've got the opportunity to mix. And obviously, there is a creative flair. Now, I said you're not a producer, but there are some guys that travel with their bands and they happen to have produced the band. That's fine. But in that moment, the band is producing the sounds, and you've got almost an easier role of representing to the audience because you were in the studio, you understand it. And we spoke about this the other night, building relationship with bands. So if you are mixing a front of house mix or even monitor mix, having a relationship, having spent time with the guys, knowing what their expectation is, you've got a better chance of fulfilling what their requirements are and what the people are expecting. There's so many guys that can tell you a story that they were at a festival, they mixed, they happened to be the guy there, the band rocked up because of budget or transport issues or something, and they didn't have a guy. You were the opportunity, you were there. And then afterwards, the manager comes to you and says, listen, we really like how you work. Do you want to come tour with us? Or, are you available next week? Or anything like that. And those are great opportunities you get. But that also means you've done them justice. You've matched their expectation. And that's a very powerful thing to do. And that's obviously putting your best foot forward. And then I always say that, I use an example when I'm in a classroom where if I had to show you a picture, I had to take masking tape, and I showed you guys a circle, and you can all see how it's round, and if you tilt it slightly, even if you're colorblind, you can see there's little circles on the inside, and if I turn it in different directions, it's about this wide. I don't have to use words to explain these visuals. So, it's quite easy that this is the reference to what I'm busy talking about. But if we're talking about audio, and I had to and we've all fell for this. If you're standing next to a guy mixing, or you're sitting next to a guy mixing in studio, or you're on stage next to a guitarist, and you're another guitarist, which means you understand what they're doing, and they go, yo, can you hear that? Unless you've been with him for the last 20 minutes, you don't know where his perspective is at. He's working on, or he's done something subtly to a compression, an EQ, or anything like that. And it's just, in his mind, it's changed a lot. And you obviously have to hear the difference because he heard it, and they'll say something, and then unless he explains himself, you're not going to really know what he's talking about. But we don't want to look bad, so we go, oh yeah, that's cool. But it's people miss each other, and I've seen it happen as well. And I've walked up to a guy, or I've done something, and people go, oh, that's nice. I'm like, okay, are they talking about what I did, or or I walk up and then a guy goes, oh, do you like that? I'm like, okay, you need to be a little bit more specific than that because there's too much going on here. Point it out to me. And that's even if you do that, then it's difficult because audio is not something you can point out like that. You have to explain a lot more. It's like that's what I was saying in the beginning. If you talk about how wet the water is when someone jumps out, you can talk about temperature and all that kind of stuff, but you can't talk about the wetness. So it's an interesting conundrum we find ourselves in. Workflow, obviously, and I've said this almost in every session now, being responsive and not reactive. Being responsive meaning you've established a workflow, you know your consoles, you know your tools. You've set up compartmentalized workflows within your workflow in terms of managing rhythm section, vocals, effects, all those kind of elements. If it's a bigger band, you might have multiple keyboard stations, things like that. And you build yourself up to a point where you can respond and work with them. My take, for example, on a keyboard station, if I have Lebel Morolo on keyboards, and he's got 4 keyboards around him, he's Jupiter, he's Kronos, he's Montage, then I will basically do a line check. I'll set the gains, and I'll get him to play his sounds, and I'll set the gain so I can get faders to 0 or keep my faders around 0. And then I will trust that a musician of his caliber, when I receive a sound from any one of those keyboards, it's in context with how he's playing it. In other words, you'll watch the guy, and I'll generally wait for them to finish their sound check. In other words, he's happy with what the blend he's hearing is in his ears in terms of volume that was set with the gains. And then if he pushes a pad up a little bit, or he drops a piano down underneath the pad a bit, or features the piano a bit more, I don't have to mix that. But if you do this in stages, that means after you've done your line check and when you do your sound check, you've got to be very specific about at which point do you set gains. If you go and readjust the gains after he's balanced himself out, what he's hearing in his ears on his ME system or his MyMix or his iLive system or whatever is not what you're hearing, because he's already set a balance, and now you're going to go and correct it with gains to get your faders level. That's not what I'm saying. You have to do it. You need to set your gains. Once your gains are set, he goes and changes, and when he's done, you'll notice that maybe your pads have dropped down a bit, and you want to put your gains up. You can't. You shoot yourself in the foot there. I'm not saying that you can't get a blend with the faders, but going from song to song to song, where he's changing pads, he's changing patches, you need to trust that he's producing the sound that's coming from his station. So you need to be able to do that. Same thing with the drummer. If a drummer's playing with a feel and he's playing with dynamic, and he goes from brushes to cross stick to, snapper on, snapper off, all those kind of things. You don't keep changing the gain or keep changing the fader level. You're trusting that he's playing in that groove. Some drummers are phenomenal at doing dynamic control within themselves, within the different elements. Others, not so experienced guys, not always the same, depending on the songs. And it's quite interesting, even as a sound guy, if you really like the song and you're really into it, you spend a lot more attention on what you're doing. Same thing with musos on stage. So you almost have to make a purposeful decision that to put the same effort into everything, because there are going to be some songs that's not your favorite, other songs that are your favorite, but you need to give it the same focus. So you need to, when you set your workflows up, I actually run my VCAs like that. I'll have a VCA for Lebo, if he's the one keyboard player, and if it's Koli on the one, or if it's Joseph or Lungelo or whoever's playing on stage, I'll have a VCA for that person, and in that VCA is all of his channels associated with him. And if he happens to be playing, if a drummer's playing an SPD, the SPDs, I'll actually keep that in the VCA of the rhythm section of the drums or the percussion section. I'll explain that now, because even on the SPD there's patches where the drummer is playing and he's got a bell and he's got a snapper and he's got other kind of things where he's preset levels, which again is not always up to you. Now I will sometimes, depending on the effectiveness of it, because obviously you've got to take the context of a drummer's perspective and on a big PA, there's going to be a different dynamic outcome. So I need to know whether he wants to have those certain sounds featured more than others, which is the discussion, either with the music director. Like I said, if I'm doing a project like The Voice and James is there and he's got snaps or something in some of the tracks and I find them a bit soft, I could easily just turn them up. But, I didn't produce a song, and he might want them very, 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 very subtle. So then I'd leave them there, but I won't just, and every now and again, he goes, oh yeah, I forgot to turn those up. But he wouldn't do that if I didn't communicate. Or if I communicate and he says, no, it's actually fine. They you know what, we don't actually really need them. I'm going to mute them. And he's done that, because he had them there when he was building the session. And eventually you can't even hear them because they're so low, but they're still there, so it's background noise. I make a point, I feature it, I mention it, and he takes it from there. So it is a very interesting concept. On that same note, I mentioned it the other night where if you've got a bassist on stage and the guys are running stems and there's a synth bass in the stems, which bass are we featuring? And if they've written parts for it, you can feature both. But sometimes there's a synth bass or an electronic bass because when they were building the track, they didn't have the band. So then again, just work with them and communicate. You don't decide what's in the music or not. Having said that, I have in the past taken a keyboard or taken a pad and taken it out the mix because it's masking something specific on a vocal cord or something like that, where I feel that it's not working. And if it's in the show, you don't really have time. But if it's in rehearsals, when I've done that, again, after the show, if there's a break or anything like that, or if there's a chance on talkback, if I have the MD on talkback, I'll say it straight out. I've on that third pad on the Ableton session, I pulled it down in the mix because it's clashing with something that's happening on stage, and then they'll listen. And if they go, no, hey, on, that's we want it quite prominent, then we need to come to a compromise of, well, how am I going to get that to feature? Because if it keeps clashing, then I'm going to have to do something else to try and match it, either with an EQ or try and separate the sounds with panning or with a slight reverb or something like that. But there has to be purpose behind everything you do. I often tell students and young guys, if you can tell me why you did something, there isn't a right or a wrong. Whether I like it or other people like it, different story. But if you've got a reason for doing it, your opportunity for learning is so much greater. If you do something and there's reason behind it and it didn't work, you've learned something for the next time, and you've got different ways of applying things for the next time. Same thing with doing something on purpose, is you remember what you've done that works. There's nothing worse than someone trying to find an EQ or fiddling or doing something on the console because they did something last night and now they're just trying to recreate that. That doesn't work either. You got to do things on purpose, and you can do a lot of pre-production in your mixes. That's something that I feel some guys don't get enough time to do. If you have got the luxury of spending time on a console before it goes to site to set it up, even if it's just your channel strip. These days with the offline editors for every single brand, there's opportunity to prepare yourself. There's no excuse to be caught off guard behind the console. If you don't have time because it's a festival or something like that, you still have the opportunity to make sure that you know that console very well. And when we spoke the other night about workflows, you need to prioritize what's important in your mix. If you're working with a country western artist, that lead vocal and that lead guitar, the tone of the drum kit and certain elements and the guitars and stuff are priority. And you need to take it from that perspective, and having that little subtle triple delay somewhere on a vocal or something like that, if you get a chance to do that, you're lucky. But if you don't, you need to go where the people are and what they're watching. Obviously, there's a time period, and if you've got a 45-minute set, when I say you've got a priority list, by the end of the first song, you've got to have everything there. You've got no more excuses because the crowd's getting into it with you, and by the end of the first song, the band's out, they settled in, there's dynamic changes and all that. If you're still fluffing around with stuff by that time, you either don't know the music or you don't know the technology, or you weren't prepared mentally in terms of having a plan in your head. I often, when I get to festivals, I tell the story where I'll take the long road. You've got a VIP tag, you can jump around the stage, go straight down the middle. There's shortcuts, you can get a guy to escort you to the front of house. Those are all cool, but they always take you out of the where the people are. I don't like that. I'll try and go to the far left or right of the stage, try and get through the crowd, and then walk in a big arc all the way to front of house. Sometimes even all the way around the back, and then walk down the middle. This way I can hear what the PA response is, the coverage of the PA is, what the people are experiencing in terms of the level. And then you step into front of a house, and you've now walked the room, so you can hear whether there's a power alley, you can hear whether there's some misguiding effects happening from the structure on the HF. You can hear so many different elements, and also you're removed from the crowd now. So if you step into front of a house and it's way too loud, you get a tendency to mix down a bit, but then it's too soft in the crowd or something like that. And vice versa, or the low end. So it's just getting your headspace in context, so that, and then I'll walk back to the backstage. I'll go check out all the gear. I like being early. I'm always early to everything if I can. And then, walk around, meet the crew, see what they've got, check what they've got, talk to stuff, go to front of house, look at the band that's before you, look at the template he's running. If he's running something that you can work from, then you can, just adapt from there. You don't have to start from a blank slate if you don't have time. If you can work with someone else's stuff, even better. So it's having a plan, trusting the band, having a relationship, and enjoying what you're doing. I think that's what it comes down to. A guy that wants to spend an hour on kick, another half an hour on snare, an hour on hi-hat, and if we had unlimited budget and we've got a full technical team with musicians in it that can give us in a warehouse or a stadium or somewhere, we've got 2-3 days with everything set up to do technical checks and sound checks before the band gets there, which happens in some parts of the world. That's great, and then you've got time, but you can start overthinking things. Context is probably the most important and the most effective way of working. So doing your technical stuff, doing your capturing right, getting your kick drum to sit in the mix right, all these kind of things is much more important than having a perfectly toned or programmed kick in isolation. If anybody knows me and they've worked with me or been taught by me, they know that if you sit with a solo button and headphones on, I just stop listening to what you're doing because you're taking yourself out of context. So just keep paying attention. And I think again that's just a way of saying that the outcome that you're there to achieve has to take priority. So we're here to serve the band, we're here to represent what they're doing the best, and your ability to do that is key. I'm going to move over to a couple of the questions we got last night. I'm going to answer them first, and then I'm assuming there's some other questions that have come in already. I liked what I saw in the group. There were some questions and answers questions that were being answered. Adrian jumped in there and answered some. I'm going to go through them again just in case some of you didn't read them. The first question I got in was from François Steenkamp, which was matrix mixers and how to use them. So matrix mixers is on all consoles. Not all. I'm talking about MI market up. And a matrix just gives you the opportunity to have an alternative output on the console. I think I mentioned it last night that one of the workflows I follow every time, no matter what console I'm working on, is I hardly ever send my left and right directly to the PA. I send my PA a feed from a matrix, which means I'll feed the matrix from my left and right. That also means if I have to tune my PA or do any kind of EQing on the PA or delay, anything like that, I'm not doing it on my left and right. My left and right stays a true source of my desk. So if I had to record my mix, I would record my left and right. If I had to send it to a broadcaster, I would send my left and right. If I have to send it to a VIP tent, I would send my left and right via matrices. And then every matrix can have a delay or an EQ on it appropriate to its outcome. This means your PA, if you happen to be in a room that's got, one of our older rooms, like one of the state city halls that we've got, they've got some really interesting challenges because they were all built pre-electronics. So they're all massive reverb chambers. And now we go and add in split point amplification in and wonder why we can't get past our critical distance issues. Critical distance is just a point in the room where your direct sound, your reverberant sound are equal in volume. Anything past that distance, the reverb is the dominant. So it's very difficult to have distinction. If this was in a talking environment, for example, and you're trying to talk to people and most of them are sitting past the critical distance, they're having to concentrate on what you're saying because there's so much other noise happening that people get tired and they fall asleep. I'm not saying it's the only reason. If you have a big 500 kg or gram steak and then go and sit down for half an hour, you're going to fall asleep. But it's just important to understand things. So what you can do is you can work and you can process and you can deal with some nodes. Reverbs are very difficult thing to deal with. The best way of dealing with reverb in that situation, just go away from a big PA, distributed PA, a lot of sources at low level, try and get everybody as close to a source of sound as possible, which obviously doesn't help for music, but you're getting your quality up. But you feed those off matrices. So to answer Francois' question, a matrix is just something that is a very valuable tool to use to control multiple different outcomes off of one console. I hope that answers your question. Katlejo, how do you deal with spacing in your mix? Very technical question, potentially. Spacing in a mix is something that is probably happens automatic if the music has been produced well. And what by produced well means you've got a music director that has briefed have written the music well for that context. There's a 4-piece band or a 6-piece band. Everybody has their parts. They've got their spaces to play. I think Joseph said it the other night on the producers talk, where just don't neglect the opportunity to do less, because the moment you back off on one thing, something else is featured. Then that space starts happening automatically. If you have 2 guitarists, for example, that play in the same register, 2 rhythm guitars or an acoustic guitar and a rhythm guitar playing in the same register, in other words, they're playing in the same spot on the neck. If you have them both pan to the middle, or they're both coming out of all the sources, they can sum quite nicely and they can blend and mask each other. So by just opening up your pan, just separating them slightly. And I'm not saying about full left and hard right, because you still want everybody, but when you open them up slightly, you get a little bit of time delay between the left and the right on the arrivals of the audience, and there's a bit of distinction. And there's other ways of doing it, is focusing on what the sounds are intended to be. For example, in gospel music, your BV section these days are so well produced in the parts and the harmonies that they are singing, that the tones that you can create, if you go and listen to some of the albums that the guys are producing, and I often do that, if someone has an album out, I go listen to what they did with the BVs on the album, and the BVs are very tight, very precise, in a very specific frequency range, even where they don't mask the lead vocal, the pads of the keyboards are coming through nicely, all of that, which means the low mids are quite clean. Then you can do the same thing. You can do high pass filters very high on your vocal mics. If the vocalists sing by themselves, it's an issue. So if one of the BVs is going to sing a solo at some point, again, if you're responsive, you can deal with it. And on most consoles these days, you can switch on and off on the gains control some of the EQ section. So the low mid, if I've been filtering it quite a bit to thin out the vocals so they can sit in a group, and I know in one song a certain vocalist is going to sing something, I'll just switch off the low mid filter, and their mic warms up a little bit again. But I can't do that while they're singing, which means I've got to know the music, I've got to be preemptive. And then obviously just your use of delay and your use of reverb and reverbs. Reverb is something that the presets on reverb these days are, it's, again, a preset on its own, or a reverb unit on its own, is just a source. You have to bring it into your context. Why do you want the reverb on something? Are you spacing it? Are you making it fuller? What are you doing? So you need to understand how the reverb unit works, what the decay times mean, what the pre-delay times mean, how you can separate something to give a bit of space to it. And even EQing. Very few people EQ their reverbs. Like I just spoke about what we did on backing vocals. I have to match the reverb into that context. So if I've got a reverb with a big full body low end, that can be clashing with my keyboard parts, so stick to where it is, EQ the reverbs, and what you're doing is, if you're in a live context, and remember guys, this is what we're talking about, there's no stop button, there's no rewind. You've got a certain set of frequencies you can deal with. You've got a time signature, a time period that's running. You've got technical restraints on your PA and what it can deliver and what it can't deliver. That's a discussion for another day, where guys they try and do in their mix stuff that the PA can't reproduce. So we're assuming in all my talks tonight, the PA is amazing. So just be specific, so spaces in your mix. I think if your music's been well produced, that's coming towards you, like I said, you're not the producer. If it's been well produced, a lot of it happens automatically. I've mixed bands and mixed at festivals where you work yourself and you're sweating, you're trying things. The band does 4 or 5 songs, and it's like, oh man, and you're getting there and you're feeling that it might work, and then they've finished. 15-minute turnaround, another band comes on, you're like, oop, what happened? And it sounds amazing. You've done nothing. It's the source. Okay, so don't take that for granted. And I often have people, what do you do if the band's not that good? Yeah, that's a philosophical question, where if you don't have a relationship with them, keep your mouth shut. If you do have, keep your mouth shut. It's worse. Nothing you can do than, if you start criticizing people and have an opinion about that, you're not going to work for them for long. But people learn. A lot of guys will ask opinions, and they'll ask, how did it sound? How did it go? And if you can answer them productively, give them input. Something I learned from my dad many years ago, that If what you're about to say is not going to be positively contributing to the situation, shut up. In other words, don't spew an opinion if it doesn't have a positive effect. So if someone asks you, how was it? There's something like being brutally honest, but it's going to be productive. And that, again, the only way you know that is relationship. Aidan Quipman, what is the best way to feed subs? Does a center out make sense? So what he's talking about there is a lot of little consoles have got a left-right and a center, or left-right and mono. And what guys do is they take left-right and the mono and whatever they want to the subs, they've routed to the sub or to the center or the mono, and then they run their subs off that. But what you do in that context, if it's your bass guitar, what's not on that mono out, there are some consoles that you can switch it to be a sub feed. I'm trying to think of one that comes to mind now, where you tell the console that that's a sub feed, which means it puts a low pass filter onto that output, which means you get a nice clean sub signal to your subs. If you're feeding it through a processor, like Adrian was talking the other night about one of the LE sub processors, and it knows it's feeding subs from an auxiliary source, which could be from a mono or a center source, then the system will process the right sound, gets that. Too many times these days, guys are feeding it and they're not paying attention to the signal that's coming out of that feed. If it's processed for subs and you're going into a unit that's managing it, how you're doing it is up to you, as long as you know what you're sending to the sub. Because the best way to damage your subs is sending stuff there that you don't know you're sending there, or assuming that the right stuff is going there. And sending a signal with a low pass filter at 160, but your sub's designed to work optimum from 95 down. There's a big chunk of energy you're sending to that driver that it doesn't want to be doing, and it's just muddy, and it overworks, and it overheats, and it basically minimizes the efficiency tremendously. So it's not wrong. The best way to do it, if you want to feed subs separately, would be a post-fade auxiliary, which means you can go to the channels that you want to do post-fade, send it, and if you have the capability of tuning that, if you're on a digital desk these days, do a low-pass filter on that output to make sure you clean it up. In my mind, the way I would run subs almost as much as I can would be, I want a full-range system. I want left and right, which means I'm managing my signal in here, and the system management, which is the DSP unit, manages the sub or the distribution of frequency ranges into the system as it's been designed into the room. A lot of engineers want it because of special effects. For example, when I did the Lofters last year, I ran a big PA. We had S28s, G28s, a lot of subs. And I ran the majority of the system full range. And then I had a couple of G28 subs, and I did put those on a separate post feed on 2 or 3 elements. And that was it. It wasn't on everything. So the system was full range with a bit of supported low-end sub just for that extra grunt, a little bit on the SPD and on one of the keyboards from Level and stuff like that, where I knew the pads that he was playing and the effect that they were going to have and what the effectiveness was going to be. But again, planning. Katlejo was asking a bunch of questions about monitoring specifically. His first one and Adrian answered this, if those want to go read it, and Adrian answered it very straightforward. How do you deal with a situation where you're doing front of house and monitors off one console and your lead vocalist is not happy with the EQ of their mic? The blessing is these days with digital consoles, we've got soft patching. So the first thing you do is you take that source, split it onto 2 channels, send the one to monitors and send the one to front of house. It's as simple as that. Not all consoles can soft patch all inputs. If you're working on a QU, for example, without a stage rack, you can't soft patch the hard ports. So you're going to have to use an analog way of splitting, which is this Y piece. But that's the easiest way to do it. It works. I mean, I've got an artist where I split it 3 ways because they use the in-ear and they use wedges, and I've got the PA. I'll have a separate EQ on the in-ear. I'll have a separate EQ to the wedge and a separate EQ on the front of house, so that I have the effect that I want. He hears what he wants in different scenarios. So I think that was a good question. And then the other question, which Adrian answered as well, is just what's the, with in-ear monitors specifically, mono or stereo. Katlejo is saying that he's only experienced it with one band that insisted on having stereo. this is something that I'm going to go into in depth with when I speak to Simon. I chatted to Simon the other day, with monitors, where it is subjective, and at the end of the day, we talk about outcome. If the artist is willing to wear both ears, like I am at the moment, I've got 2 ears in here, and I'm sealed, which means both ears are hearing the same situation, perspective, it's brilliant. But the minute I crack the one, like I have now, I even hear what I'm hearing now is like everything's changed completely, and it's people do that because they say they want to hear the audience, they want to feel the room, all that kind of stuff. But what you don't realize is the quality of this is just deteriorated by 75%. I've seen artists, believe it or not, do that on both ears, and they just, because it's loud enough, so I just pop them a bit, but then the mix is so loud, and then they want to know why there's no low end. So there's two elements: education from the artist's perspective, use the ears correctly, and if you can have time to educate the artist, if you're fortunate enough to travel with an artist, get them on ears. But the first thing is not just buying ears. It's getting ears, and you as an engineer to know, I need to immediately put up reference mics. Get a good quality of set of condenser mics, put up even if it's a spaced pair, left and right of stage, process them in, spill them into his ears just a little bit so that he can hear the crowd. Make sure that there's a stereo image, because if someone on the left screams, he wants to look left, which means it's opposite to front of house. Having a XY pair or a good set of mics right in the position of the lead vocalists gives you a very good spatial awareness. And then on top of that, there's two approaches when it comes to the mixing. I've had artists where they're playing and they want the people on their left to be to their left, people on their right to be to their right. Nice stereo tracks and stuff like that, and then their vocals and stuff in the middle. And that works, Other people want a proper stereo mix. So again, it's outcome based. These days with technology like Clang, the DWR is distributing now with the Digico consoles, you get more than stereo. You get full 360 depth perception, which is amazing. It's complicated. There are cheaper solutions, more expensive solutions. You don't have to integrate just with Digico. You can have a standalone system, but you need to understand the technology. I mean, that Clang can go as far as having tracking your movement by adding a piece to the back of your head, and when you turn around, your image turns around, which means the drums are behind me. I'm having a mix. The mix sounds great. I've got a guitar on my right. I've got a vocalist on my left. When I turn around and I look at the drummer, the vocalist is still over there, and the drummer is still, now the drummer's in front of me, and the image has changed in my head. So it's very powerful software, that. But it's a very, what's the English word? It's by Afrikaans. It's a symbiotic relationship between a monitor engineer and a artist. They have to know what they want. You need to know how to give it to them. And the two of you need to work together. I mean, I've had situations where an artist has walked onto stage with both ears. It's been a female, I can't see their ears. I did sound checks, and we do a couple of shows, and about the second or third show, they come off and they make very weird comments about monitoring having changed, or what's different. It's just not the same, or I think my dressing room didn't put my pack at the right volume, and you check and everything's right. And then I say, but did you have both ears in? No, not tonight. I've had a bit of a cold, so I just took out the one. That changes now, if I knew that going up, and if I'm a monitor engineer, when I listen to that person's mix, what will I do? I'll take out the one ear, because that's what they're hearing. It doesn't help me doing a mix with both ears in if they've got one ear in. Now, it's not healthy. I hate doing it because it messes my ears up. I often work with my MEPs, my earplugs. If I have to, especially with setups, I'll take out one ear, put an MEP plug in, so I can keep my attenuation low in my head. And then I'll swap out my ears through the day, because I've got people coming up to talk to me and all that, and I don't want to take my ears out all the time. But when you're working with someone in stereo, you've got to be in the same context. So that's a long answer to a very short question. I hope that answers it. Lungelo, I have a question, Cristo. How do you mic and mix an organ for front of house? Typical Lungelo to ask that question. Lungelo is an organist, by the way. So over the years, I do a lot of gospel stuff. Obviously, an organ is a major feature, and on a live stage, the trouble with an organ is the organ. It's an acoustic device. It's large. It's got a set length of cable. You can make the cable a bit longer. It's got a very set character. It's a very finicky instrument. It's mechanical. You need to know how it works. You know how the whole thing fits together. But then the miking of it is, I approach it very similar to what I do any other source. Is I have a listen, and I make sure that I know what the box or the Leslie sounds like. There's different Leslies on the markets, and even some of the Leslies that look the same, they don't sound the same at all. They've got definite character traits. Some of them have had some really hard times, and they get treated very badly in transport. So sometimes you're just checking that all the screws are tight, everything is sounding nice, there's no rattles or anything that shouldn't be there, and just making sure that it sounds good. And then having listened to it like that, using the appropriate mics. You want good quality high end. You want to get as close as you can without getting in too close. I these days use my my Audio Technica AE 2300 microphones. I get them in quite close. I put pop filters on them because there's a rotary in there and there's wind blowing. And then the same thing on the low end. And then I just make sure that I can isolate it as much as possible. Even when I work on my stage layout and my stage design, you know, the way that the positioning of that Leslie is critical. And then once it's positioned properly, miking it up, getting it to sound great, and then isolating it, having sober panels or some kind of acoustic box is vital. You know, if you, the last time I had a big stage where, you know, you have a massive PA, 30,000 plus people in the stadium, but if you go in solo, in our recordings afterwards, I went and listened to it. There's about between 10 and 15% max spill onto the mics of the Leslie, which was right behind the PA. And that also means that the organist is hearing the organ. It's amazing. They're not overdriving it. They're playing it nicely. It just works. And there's nothing as sweet as an organ that really just sings, you know, because you also want the organ to be sounding good. So I hope that answers. I answered both your questions. Your second question was on the mics, which I just answered. Thanks, Lungelo. Katlejo is asking another question. Delaying your main PA affects your matrices. Well, if you're feeding your main PA off of a matrix, and I wouldn't know why you would delay it. Okay, rephrase. When your PA is being set up, obviously you have to have a 0 point. In other words, in a room where you've got multiple hangs, at some point you've got to design it. Where's your 0? On a big stage, what I've done in the past, I've done it a couple of times, I'll take center stage, drum position, snare, make that 0. Which means I'm putting a slight delay on my main PA. But because the space is so big, you know, the ambient sound, the people on stage can't hear it. In fact, it actually brings cohesion because the snare, acoustic snare behind them is in line with what they're hearing of PA or the feel of it. But the people out front, off the front delays or the front fills, is hearing the acoustic snare off the stage, and they're hearing the PA already in time with that. So which means they have a better experience. So plenty of ideas there when it comes to PA setup, but delaying your main feed affects your matrices. Well, again, your matrices are going to alternative outputs, and they all have their own processing. If you're delaying your PA, you're not doing it on your left and right, which I spoke about earlier being the source. You're doing it on the feed to the PA, and even better on the processing for the PA. So it shouldn't affect any of your other matrices, because ideally they're ending at completely different outcomes. I think I answered that question. Yeah. So that was the last question that Johannes just sent me. If there are any more, he'll pop through. So thanks for those questions, guys. Those were great. I think just to come back to the whole mixing side, tips and tricks of mixing, which is what I call the session. I've given you a lot of tips in terms of your approach. What I do with let me just talk about VCA structure. So if those of you that don't know what VCAs are, voltage controlled amplifiers. So VCA is a way of controlling a set group of faders without influencing their summing to the main bus. It's different to a subgroup. A subgroup contains your audio, it sums the audio together and then sends it on. A VCA is purely just a sidechain voltage control, which means if I have a set balance between a drum, a drum set and I pull the VCA all the way down, that relationship as it gets softer remains the same mathematically and voltage wise. So what I do is I use generally between 3 and 4 VCAs just for a drum kit. Now I'm fortunate that I'm on an SXL. I've got 48 VCAs these days. So I've got enough VCAs. If you're on a VI 3000 and you've only got 16 VCAs, you're still powerful. If you're on one of the older consoles and you only have 8 VCAs, you've got to really think about how you prioritize what you put in VCAs. So it's important that your VCA structure manages what you're on. So what I would do is I would have a groove section, which would be my VCA 1. Groove would be kick, snare, hats, bass, which bass guitar. So kick, snare, hats, bass, guitar, they work very well together when I'm working with genre, when I'm working in different aspects. I want to be able to, when the rhythm section's really going for it, that's where I'm controlling the anchor in my mix. I have another one, which my next VCA would be what I would actually label it percussion. So I'd label it percussion, and percussion as part of the kit would be your toms and overheads. And if there was an SPD, I would put it in there as well. And then I would bring all the drums into a third VCA and call it my drum kit, which would be all the drum channels. So I have one VCA, which is the entire kit, but then within that, I've got different. And if I have more VCAs like I have on some consoles, I would separate out the toms and the overheads as well on separate VCAs, and you end up with 3 or 4. Then I would have my guitars. I would have, like I said, I would have different keyboard players on different VCAs, depending on what keyboard they're playing. With someone like, if I have a dedicated organist, I would have the organ as a VCA. If the organist happens to be playing keyboards, I would separate that. So I would have the organ, because the organ is a very unique thing which I want to keep and I want to ride. I want to spool that out separately, and it becomes a very significant tool to use, especially in gospel events where the crowd is singing. So this is an idea where, like I said earlier, we're not producers, but it's vital that we understand what the band is trying to do, because if a crowd sings along, which gospel crowds tend to do, your PA needs to be able to handle that, because you need to try and stay at least 3 dBs or more above the ambient noise, in other words, the unison that they're singing. But that brings in a completely different masking effect in terms of what the crowd is hearing. So there's where, if your full knowledge of the genre is important to make sure that elements within the mix that can really help your crowd participate in what the band is doing. I would make sure that I've got the ability to manage and keep those under control. Having said that, going on, I'll have my BVs, and what I do as well with the drum kit, in my overall drum VCA, I'll put the drum effects. In my overall vocal VCA, I'll put my vocal effects, and going on like that, so that I have control. The only effect I would pretty much keep on its own in its own VCA, if I have to build a layer for it, would be the delays and the echoes on the main vocals, so that I have access to them quite quickly without affecting anything else. And yeah, that's it. But it's just planning. So what I end up wanting to do is I want to and then even my spacing of my VCAs and positioning. I would sometimes, like I spoke about the drum VCA and the groove and the percussion VCA, they wouldn't necessarily be next to each other, because what I want, especially I'm right-handed, so on my right hand I would have very specific VCAs that I want to have at my disposal, where I've got the band, I maybe have the drum kit, or even the groove and not the drum kit. The drum kit with VCA will be a bit further away. I'd have to move my hand for that. But it's just planning so that I can manipulate the flavor of what's happening going with an audience. And if it's not a gospel gig, if it's a rock and roll gig, you can take the same approach where you have what's necessary to get that crowd going at your fingertips, and have control over those elements. We've got some more questions that have come in. Masters, I think I answered that question. You're asking how do you fix 2 instruments that are fighting for the same frequency? For example, on stage I was mixing for a band, drum kit, bass, guitar, percussion, keys, violin, 6 BVs. the guitarist and the violin. So again, this comes down to, and if producers are listening, I've had these conversations with many producers. I can't fix that. If in this scenario that you just listed here, if there's a guitarist and a violin and they're clashing, in that song, if the guitarist is playing a better role or a more constructive role, only one can win the fight. Otherwise, it's a mess. So you're going to have to make an executive decision as to which one works if you're in the situation. The ideal thing to do is, if it's in a rehearsal and you've got time, is to go to the music director and say to him, there's a problem. In that song, these two people are playing the same thing and they're fighting for the same space. Help. And for him, it's a question of, okay, hang on, you play this part, you play that part, or you transition this, or you do that, or change your patch. If I have a relationship with the guys, and I've done this with, I mentioned like Raymond Green, where I've gone to him and I say, listen, in that one song, when you hit your overdrive, your reverb's gone, or this has happened, or that's happened. Can we change that patch? Can we just check? And he'll make a different setting for that patch for that song. Because he appreciates what I'm doing if I'm doing a broadcast mix and how it can translate so that it works for him. But if you don't have a relationship, you take it to the MD, they've got to work on that. If you've got a musical ear, you go up and you say, listen, the BVs are sounding amazing, but in that one harmony, the chord that they're singing and the chord that's being played is different. There's a different note in there. Can you just check that? And then the pianist will go, listen, there's the chord, and they're singing, ooh, okay, hang on, let's fix. Fortunately, that doesn't happen too often, but it's happened, and they don't always hear it because muscle memory and the way that their monitors are mixed and all that, and the main pianist is not necessarily listening to the BVs, he's listening to the lead vocalist and other musos and stuff like that, so these kind of things can happen. There's a question here from Olokani. So VCA is the same thing as a DCA? Yes. DCA is something that Yamaha coined, early 2000s when they launched the M7s. They call it DCAs, which is digitally controlled amplification. It functions as a VCA. VCA is just, that's where the VCAs have been around way before digital consoles. It's not a digital term, it's voltage. So yes, it's the same thing. I hope that answers your question there. That's our last question for now. I'll wait to see if there's more that comes through. Almost an hour already. Time flies when you're having fun. My coffee's gotten cold. Brian's got a question. What works better between aux-driven subs and matrix subs? Brian, I don't know when you joined the talk. I spoke about this about half an hour ago, so rewind your feed or watch it again. But it's context-driven. Matrix-driven sub, if you can process your low pass, and you've got the ability, depending on what consoles you're in, on some consoles, the only thing you can feed a matrix from is one of the output buses. You can't necessarily feed it from any input channel. On a Yamaha, you can, on the M7, for example, and some of the newer ones. On some of the more expensive consoles, you can, again, even on the VI 3000s and all that, you can choose almost any source to be a matrix source. So then you can get away with that. But as a rule, matrices are fed from your buses, not from your channels. So if you would have an auxiliary setup, and that's how I run it. I set up an auxiliary, post-fade, and I'll feed it to a matrix, and I'll process the matrix for the subs. I won't send the auxiliary straight there, because I have my matrices controlling everything that's leaving the console. So it's a combination of that. I hope that answers your question. And I think that's going to be close to being us for the evening. I'll keep my eye on the questions as they come through. I think, if anything, that if I want you to get some takeaway from this is just have a plan, be prepared, know what you're getting yourself into. You do have homework to do. You always have homework to do. Even if you've worked with a band for a long time, phoning ahead, checking the gear that's available, making sure you understand it, get there early, prepare yourself. Have your priority list, have a good understanding of your workflow in your head so that you can adapt to the scenarios that you get. And at the end of the day, make sure that you're doing the band justice. If the band's performing amazingly and you can represent that to the audience, that's first prize. There's nothing worse. And I said earlier, there's a lot of guys that have got opinions and they tell you this is what a band should sound like. Don't listen to those guys, or don't listen to people that want to force their opinion on you. But one thing I can say is if you're a sound guy and you're a big rock and roll fan, expand your horizon. Listen to lots of music, different genres, stuff that you wouldn't find yourself listening to, so that you get an idea of the fact that there is different genres. If you're a big jazz lover and you love doing jazz, and you get asked to mix rock and roll shows, your approach has to be rock and roll. If you're a guy that's, if you know the console well, or the company you work for suddenly get a gig and you've never had a gig for orchestral stuff before, you got to do your homework. You know that you know what an orchestra sounds like. I mean, you can't as an engineer walk in and just put a whole bunch of mics on an orchestra and push faders up and do gain structure the way you would do anything. There's a completely different approach you have to do that does justice to the music. Same thing goes for rock, same thing goes for gospel, same thing goes for jazz. You can educate yourself so that you can be multifunctional in all those different genres. Because that's where your end client and your people that come to the show makes or breaks their experience of the show. If they know that it sounds great and it's what they're expected, you're doing it justice. Sometimes it sounds good, but it's not right, because it sounds out of context, and you'd be surprised how exaggerated that can get. If you're having a good time, but you're really struggling. It's almost like swimming against the tide. You think you have it, and you're moving back, and you're just not finding that balance, and the band's irritating you, and this and that. Meanwhile, it could be just the simple fact that what you think you're doing and what the band's doing is two different things. So get an understanding of what they're doing, get an understanding of what they're trying to achieve, and then you can go with that. And that's much easier. If you turn around and swim with the current, you're going to go a lot faster and do a lot less work. So that's my little piece of advice. Just focus on yourself, build your strength, build your confidence, understand what you're doing, practice, 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 practice. I mean, there's lots of stuff you can do. Practice workflows and doing simple stuff on everything. If you've got opportunity to work on new consoles or go to seminars, go for it. Not that they can teach you or think that people want to teach you stuff, just to develop your database of technology so that you can be more effective. And it makes you more useful as a freelance tech as well. If you are freelance, the more gear you know well, the more effective you can be. So I think that's it for me for tonight. I really appreciate all you guys logging on. I haven't seen any more questions come through. So I'm going to say good night. Tune in again. I'm going to do another section early next week on mixing and all that specifically within the broadcast environment. Live broadcast specifically. Again, not studio produced, but it's a different approach. A lot of the same principles applies, but the outcomes are completely different. That'll also lead us to talking about interacting with the broadcast vans and what the different engineers on site are responsible for. So that's quite a nice chat to come up. And obviously then next week I've made contact with Marius Marais, a friend of mine. He's probably Wednesday next week, I'm hoping. We're going to have him on the show and just have a bit of a chat. That's going to be fun. So look out for our page, like our page, so you can see what we're going to be coming up with, and then we'll see you guys at the next time. Thank you.